Welcome to another episode of Bitfinex Talks. I'm your host, Ricardo Martinez. Today, my guest is Vlad Costea. Vlad is the host of the Bitcoin Takeover Podcast. He is also the author of the open source magazine, Bitcoin Takeover, where he writes all the articles and publishes it himself. He is also the father of the Supra cycle, which is a new metric to measure the Bitcoin market cycles, which will result in everyone getting a Toyota Supra and a girlfriend. Vlad, how are you? Thank you for coming on the show today.
Yes, sir. I feel very bullish today. I'm happy to be here, and I can't wait to talk about breaking FUD, getting girlfriends, buying Supras, and enjoying life, and jumping on the institutions, because that's the most important part.
Nice. Well, that's why you're on the show here today. That's why I invited you. So let's get into it. Let's talk about this super cycle. I think it's a new metric that's kind of taken the Bitcoin world by storm. Can you explain what the super cycle is and how we can all take advantage of it this bull market?
Basically, when I first got into Bitcoin, everyone was talking about getting Lambos. It wasn't when I first got into it, but a few months later in 2017. They're like, oh, it's over 10K, let's get Lambos. And I was like, I don't have enough Bitcoin to get a Lambo. And then I waited for another bull market, and I realized I still don't have enough Bitcoin to get a Lambo. And I was like, okay, I'm a pleb. I gotta admit, I was not able to get enough Bitcoin. But is there a plebs Lambo? That's the question that you need to ask yourself. And then you start looking, and you discover, when you watch the movie The Fast and the Furious, the original from 2001, you're going to see a very famous scene where there's Paul Walker and Vin Diesel who challenge a Ferrari in a drag race, and they are driving a Toyota Supra, and they just smoke it because the car is tuned. It's, it has that very special 2JZ engine, which is legendary, and that's where it struck me. It doesn't matter necessarily what kind of brand of car you buy. All that matters is that you're a good driver, and you get something that's reliable and fast, and something that is epic and legendary. And that's the Supra. I think it has the brand recognition. It has the tradition among, car collectors and enthusiasts. And it's also much more affordable than a Lambo. So it makes a lot more sense for a Bitcoiner who doesn't have a lot of Bitcoin, is not a whale, will probably never get a Lambo. And even if they could afford a Lambo, they don't see the point. I think the Supra is, much closer. It's about 90% of the experience at 10% of the price. And that's how you get girlfriends, right? Because that's what Bitcoiners want. We're nerds. We want to get girlfriends. We want to reproduce. We want to whatever. I'm not sure what your status is. I'm not going to ask. But it's a pretty nice way to drive your girl around. And if you already have one, I have this very flamboyant theory that your girlfriend gets a girlfriend, or your wife, and she's going to listen to all of her problems, take her to the nail salon, maybe, wait for her when she's shopping, and wait for her to try all the pairs of shoes in the store and make her mind, stuff like that. I mean, she deserves it, and you deserve it, so you can play video games and troll on Twitter or whatever. X, not Twitter. The Supra cycle is between 0.5 BTC to 0.1 BTC for a Supra, meaning that today you can buy a Supra for 2.5 Bitcoin, but when it's less than half a Bitcoin, that's when the Supra cycle kicks in, and you're supposed to buy a Supra because you have been stacking hard, and you deserve to get something nice for yourself so you can get a girlfriend.
That's a new twist on the super cycle that I hadn't heard, that if you already have a girlfriend or a wife, then they will get a girlfriend in the super cycle. What would you say to these critics that think that Teslas are the replacement for the Lambo as the Bitcoiner dream car?
Yeah, I don't know, man. They're simps. Elon has dumped on them, has made fun of them, has basically crashed the market in 2021. And then was like, yeah, we're not going to accept payments anymore because Bitcoin is not ESG compliant and blah, blah, blah. And then he admitted himself that ESG is bullshit. I think he said that. You can look it up. And now he doesn't want to acknowledge Bitcoin anymore. He's trolling along the lines of Dogecoin or whatever. And I'm like, why would you want to give this guy money? And what's so cool about the Tesla anyway? The fact that it's possibly the most advanced electric vehicle. I think there's some merit to it, but at the end of the day, do you want something manly, something that makes you feel strong and fast and invincible, or do you just want to look like a tech bro? And I can see that some Bitcoiners might enjoy the idea of looking sophisticated and technologically advanced with a Tesla, but just consider that it's very bad for your OPSEC. I'm not saying that the Supra is excellent for your OPSEC because you're probably gonna get stopped by the police a lot, but at least it's not getting tracked all the time, because as far as I know, there are trackers for Teslas and there's monitoring for when they charge and stuff like that. I wouldn't want to drive the kind of car that tracks everything that I do. I want to buy a car that has opt-in everything and gives me that feeling of speed and makes me feel like I used to dream of doing this when I was a teenager, playing Need for Speed games and watching the Fast and the Furious movies. And maybe that these cars from the late 90s and early 2000s are too old right now, but there are some very nice models of the Supra, the Subaru BRZ, I think the Honda Civic, but I'm not going to endorse something other than the Supra, everything else is a shitcoin.
All right, fair enough. So I guess those guys driving the Teslas probably won't get girlfriends, is what you're trying to say.
I mean, they might get girlfriends, but the wrong type of girlfriends. Not the ones that can respect you for being manly and liking to drive fast and liking to spend some time alone with your car, just enjoying driving, but the kinds that are demanding and, high maintenance and stuff. I wouldn't want to date a girlfriend who likes you because you have a Tesla, but one who respects you for having a Supra. That's something that I'm interested in. This is the Bitcoin Takeover Free Breaking FUD magazine. I wrote this as an orange pilling tool. Basically, it starts from the assumption that it has been 14 years since Bitcoin was launched. Everyone knows about it, so they have some ideas about what it might be. But those ideas that they got are coming from mainstream media and from politicians and stuff. So I tried to take the 10 most common misconceptions about Bitcoin, as in pieces of FUD, and write one article about each one of them. And the novelty of it, it's not just one element. There are at least two of them that are using AI. Basically, most of the graphics are AI generated, and I think it's possibly the first magazine about Bitcoin that uses AI generated graphics. But there's also human drawn graphics in one article, because I was able to talk with the artist, and he did these very nice Renaissance style sketches that are not specific for the magazine. So he made them because he does this type of art, but it was like the perfect discovery that he is into this. And I was more than happy to use his work and promote him. His name is written on the inner cover, and I don't want to mess it up, so I'm going to look it up. It is Bitcoin Apex. So if you want to follow him or check him out, it's Bitcoin Apex. I think it's a nice magazine because it's an open source magazine, right? So anyone around the world can download this and use it as an educational tool. More than this, I also have a translation in German that was made by a guy named Ray Risling. And that one is also open source, and you can check it out. You can download it for free. You don't need to pay me anything. You can print this yourself, take it to a conference, take it to a meetup, and basically use it as a way for your friends to understand, for example, why Bitcoin mining is not as bad as they see on television, or why Bitcoin scaling is actually working, and there are efforts to make it so much better than it already is, and why, for example, government regulation does not work the way that most people think, and why there's a game theory involved, and it makes much more sense for governments to try to profit from the existence of Bitcoin and tax that, as opposed to try to ban it, which generates parallel black markets that might be detrimental to the establishment. So there's a lot of stuff that I try to explain in this piece. And I'm trying to be honest and modest here. It's my best work so far, and I'm very proud of it. It's unfortunate that I launched it in the worst moments of the market, because right now the interest in this is not as high as last year's magazine, which was also great, by the way, and that's also open source. But I think that this is better, and you should check it out. I should probably send you a link that you can put in the description. If you want to buy a hard copy, it's being sold in two places. One is the LM Bits shop, and it's like £8. And the other one is shopinbit.com. And there it's about €30, I think. But it's a more premium copy. So this is how it goes with open source projects, right? Everyone can create their own version, their own fork. You can use very thick, glossy paper, or you can use thinner paper. It's up to you, depending on how much you want to spend on this project. You don't even need to buy it. You can print it yourself. And I think that what's nice about it is that it has these 10 pieces. And let's say that there's this about limited use cases. And someone says, there's not much you can do with your Bitcoin, right? You give them the magazine, you open it up at this article, and they're going to understand much more than they knew previously in 10 minutes of reading. It's not like a book where you have to go through the entirety of chapters from one cover to the other to be able to understand what it's about. It's more like a short guide where in 10 minutes you can get a much better understanding of the stuff that you previously knew. And I think this approach is super useful because most Bitcoin books start with a chapter, what is Bitcoin, how does it work, blah, blah, blah. Mine starts with the story about how it took me 4 years to actually get into Bitcoin from the moment when I first heard about it, and why I'm trying to help people to avoid the same cycle, to embrace this technology a lot sooner after they first hear about it. That's the purpose. My theory about this is basically that if 1 billion people read this and they buy $50 or $100 worth of Bitcoin, we can reach 100K without institutions, without BlackRock, without ETFs, without any of that. And then the institutions are going to see that the price is moving because there is genuine grassroots adoption, and they're going to FOMO in, and then we're going to dump on them. And then we're going to buy Supras and get girlfriends. And the institutions usually have weak hands, so they're not going to hold their bags for too long. They're also going to dump. And then we buy the dip, and we ride into the sunset, being victorious.
Perfect plan. This is the 3rd edition of the magazine, if I'm not mistaken. Correct?
Yeah, it's the 3rd year in which I do a magazine, and I'm planning for this to be an annual thing. I think I already have ideas for what I want to write next, but it's just a matter of choosing a concept and working on it for a few weeks. But I very much enjoy this, and I'm happy that I get to provide something to the Bitcoin education market, if we can say there's a market for this. And I'm very grateful to my sponsors also, because they finance this cool project, and I'm able to do the work, and I'm able to make this available everywhere. This week I'm taking it to Baltic Honey Badger, and next month I'm going to 2 events in Prague. One of them is the Proof of Work Summit, and the other one is the Hackers Congress. And I'm going to be able to introduce this to audiences that are not necessarily very hardcore Bitcoin. And I think these are the people who need it the most. And it's to these people that you should give this. And I'm also working on a Romanian translation for my parents, just because I want it to exist.
That was going to be a follow-up question, is if you are still attending Bitcoin events and giving the magazine away to the attendees, but you've answered that question for us.
There are moments when I cannot give it away for reasons which concern printing costs and logistics and stuff like that. So for example, at Baltic Honey Badger, I will not be able to give it away for free. I basically have to pay the bill to the organizers at the end of the event. But I don't think Baltic Honey Badger is the best place for something which is basically an educational tool for newbies. So maybe that they can learn something, like a thing or two from reading everything, but it's not going to look novel to them. But I think it's useful to promote it to these people because they can spread the word, and they can use this for someone they already know and might be skeptical about Bitcoin. And I think magazines have this quality that they don't require commitment. They feel, very relaxed and casual. You can pick up a magazine when you're waiting at the dentist or something, and you can read an article and you put it back on the coffee table, but you have learned something new, right? With books, it's different. You need to be more focused, more serious about what you're reading. And it's also funny because there are people who get invited to conferences as book authors, but I don't get that kind of recognition, even though I think I could put all of this content in a book without any issues.
I think it's a monumental effort that you've been making, considering that you research and write all the content in the magazine and then also set it for printing and generate all the artwork and all that. So
thank you. Just for the record, I do have some graphic designers that I contact. For this one, I used 3 guys actually, because I was under pressure to deliver it at Pizza Day, and I only had 1 week to do the graphics. I generated most of the images using Midjourney, but at the same time, I needed someone to do the layout, and I'm not, in terms of aesthetics, I'm not the best guy. I need someone to do something nice and organized for myself. So I gotta give credits to Leonard Lucia, who is a friend of mine here from Romania, and Bogdan Mench. Likewise, he's here from Romania. But the guy who really spent lots of nights putting this together was Andrej Čibek from Slovakia. And he has been working on some Bitcoin projects. So he does design in Bitcoin. And I spent a lot of time with him. And each time I get a translation, right? Because when someone translates it, they have a document with the text. They don't have the graphics. I contact Andre, and he is the one who puts the text on top of the layout, the design. And I gotta give him a lot of credit and lots of thanks for contributing to this. And yes, I don't want to take credit where it's not due. And for the first time in this one, I have a guest author, someone who wrote an article. It's the last one, the one that closes the story. And his name is Grafton, and he works at Satoshi Labs, which is the parent company of Trezor and Invity and Tropic Square. And I think they have a few more small companies. But basically, he wrote a story about how he was able to onboard his friend to Bitcoin. And I thought this was a very nice way to close all of this FUD breaking, to present a practical example where someone explains how he was able to convince his good friend after years of trying and what it was that convinced him.
If somebody wants to contribute to the open source nature of the magazine and help you out with a translation in a language that you don't have a translation for yet, how would they do so?
The best part is that you don't need to ask me that. You just do it. But if you need help in terms of putting the text on top of the graphics, I can help you with that. I can contact my guy. I take your text. I think if we get to that point, I will also ask someone to proofread it to make sure that it's high quality. Because nowadays, it's so easy to do translations with ChatGPT and stuff. And it's usually very good. It's about 90% there. But there's that 10% that sometimes can turn you off, because I've also experimented with it to see how well it handles Romanian. It can be convincing, but there are nuances, small details that make it sound robotic and strange, because nobody really writes or talks like that. So if you want to contribute to this, you can do it without asking for my permission and print it and sell it, make money off of it. I don't care. You don't owe me anything. But if you want me to help you with the graphics, we can talk about this. And I also had this idea that we can do fundraising campaigns like Geyser or Kellycoin or whatever, and invite the community from your country to donate to sustain your effort of translating, because I know that time is precious and you want to be rewarded for the contributions that you make. And I think that communities giving small amounts to these content creators also boosts the reputation of the project and gives them some skin in the game so that they keep on following what's happening with this effort. So there's also this alternative, but the guy who did the German translation was not interested in money at all. And the guy who's working right now on the French translation thinks that receiving funding from community is too much like an ICO, and he just wants to finish it first and then see what's the reception. So he wants to do it the old school way, just the way I did it, because I didn't fundraise before I had anything. I started pitching sponsors after I was done working, and I showed them some concept art and already had something. I think Bitcoin is different from this point of view because people like to complete what they are working on and then they think about how they monetize it, as opposed to Ethereum or whatever, where they like to present this very nice idea and then investors jump in and they chip in some amounts, and usually it ends up being disappointing.
Okay. To change the subject again, let's talk about the podcast now. What can you tell us about the Bitcoin Takeover Podcast? What season are you in? Who have your recent guests been? Who do you have slated for future episodes?
I very much like this question, and I can go on for hours, I think, because I'm super, super happy about the Bitcoin Takeover Podcast. I'm still excited about it, and I think what makes me excited is that I do it primarily for myself. I know it sounds selfish, but I just chase whatever I think is interesting for myself, and I want to learn more and hope that people are gonna keep up and listen. So I don't have a structure in terms of I want to make this as accessible as I can to my audience. I think in terms of I want to learn for myself and then be able to debate or engage in conversations about the topic. And I think recently, this 14th season, which the podcast is going to turn 5 years old in January. And most people get burned out by this point. They don't go on for such a long time specifically because they start a podcast with a concept, with an idea, and it's very hard for them to move past that. And they develop an audience that's revolving around that idea, and it tends to get boring after a while. It feels stale. You run out of guests. Something happens, But it's so nice right now in season 14. I have, for example, I had a guy from the University of Turin in Italy. His name is Fadi, and he created this very interesting privacy protocol that's called DMix. And it's like a coin join mixed with a taproot multisig, which allows participants to join this transaction where only they know who's involved in it. And on the public ledger, you cannot really tell who got involved in that sort of coin join. So it's super interesting. And I'm excited that I get all of these people who build stuff. And I don't want to undermine anyone's contribution. I've also had Ben Ark, who spoke about LM Bits and also spoke about No Star. That's the way you say it, by the way. It's not Noster, it's No Star. It means good night in Welsh. And I've also had Jameson Lopp last week. And this week I was going to publish my episode with Michael Boomy, the creator of Albi Wallet, which is very popular among Nostar users. Nostar, sorry. And I was going to publish that episode, which I recorded like 3 months ago. But I'm going to do a live stream with Paul Stortz, and we're going to talk about drivechains from a different perspective. And I'm super excited. I hope that actually I kind of stopped caring who's listening, and I'm trying to keep on being excited and do this because I'm interested in doing this. But I hope that others are going to notice the kind of work that I do and the passion that I put into this project, and also pay attention to it, because I don't know, sometimes you outgrow podcasts like Peter McCormack's or Stefan Livera's and stuff like that, that's catered toward newbies and to tell you what Bitcoin is and the basics of Austrian economics and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you want to spend some time looking for what's out there and for interesting people that sometimes you don't hear somewhere else, or you don't hear them in this context. Usually they go to podcasts when they have a new product launch and stuff like that. But yeah, I invite them randomly sometimes just to talk to them. And I think also, with all due modesty, I also try to cover some of the history of Bitcoin and get some OGs to tell us about what it was in the old days and before this number go up mentality. What was it like? What kind of mindset did they have? Why did they stick around for this? What was it that motivated them when it was such a small niche project to keep going, to create content, to write code, to develop cool software that revolves around Bitcoin? In this regard, I've had Thomas Voegelin from Electrum. I've had Peter Todd, who used to be a Bitcoin Core developer. I've had Amir Taki, who is the guy who created the BIP process to implement changes into Bitcoin. And I don't know, I try to get more OGs and I try to reach out to people. Sometimes I run into roadblocks because my podcast is not popular. It's not, super big. You don't look at it and be like, oh, if I go to this guy's show, I'm going to get thousands of views. But it's not about the number. It's about the quality of the listeners. It's about, who listens to this. And I discovered that the people who listen to this are conference attendees. And the conference attendees are mostly from the class of 2013. And they're interested in projects in which they can invest or in new stuff that gives them a new purpose, because it's been 10 years since they got into this project. They're looking for something new that's out there. So, yeah. I've also had the guy from ARC, Burak, and that was the first person to interview him.
Yeah, you have a solid lineup. One of the things I really enjoy about your podcast is that you have topics that are more for like diehard Bitcoin nerds. A lot of like more technical stuff and projects that are maybe not so publicized, but that are still very, very interesting. Another thing is I didn't know how to properly say Noster is how you say it? Or Nostra? Nostra?
Star.
No star. Okay.
No, as in no star.
No
star.
No star. Yeah. Okay. Well, I learned something new today. I've been calling it Noster since I started using it. I want to ask you about the soft fork debates that are going on right now with covenants and drivechains and all this kind of stuff that's being discussed heatedly on Bitcoin Twitter. What are your opinions, first of all, on covenants being added to facilitate things like ARC and drivechains possibly being implemented, BIP 300, BIP 301? What's your take on all this stuff?
I think all of it is wonderful and is a consequence of further decentralization. And I think it was Bitcoin Cobra, who said last year that if covenants were proposed by Peter Willey and Greg Maxwell, then the proposal would be merged without asking as many questions, because I guess we have a reputation system in this development cycle, and we tend to believe that some developers are, I guess, more competent and want what's best for the network. But when it comes from somebody else, there's extra scrutiny. But this is a consequence of decentralization, right? And the fact that you have more people interested in how this network works and wanting to improve it is nothing but good news. At the same time, it's normal for people to feel a bit scared and skeptical and think that everyone who's trying to bring some sort of refinement to what Bitcoin is as a network might be perceived as an attacker. I think the fact that this narrative that Taproot enabled ordinals also poisoned the well to some extent, because people were like, oh, this would not be possible without Taproot. And the answer is that this was always possible. You can encode data and put it on the blockchain, and this has been the case since the days of WikiLeaks, when it was super popular and people were putting data inside of Bitcoin blocks thinking that it's going to be permanent. And it turned out to be quite permanent. We haven't had any shutdowns or rollbacks. It's still there. It's just that you need the proper decryption technique to be able to identify what kind of data that is. So I think it's unfortunate that maybe it's normal, maybe it's part of getting there, to be scared in the beginning and think that everyone who proposes some sort of change is an attacker. But I also think it's wonderful that we have debates and we have all sorts of ideas on how to make this better. It's not like we ran out of ideas and this project is relying on our faith on how we're going to use it. People very much understand that the diminishing block reward and the increasing adoption needs to be as non-custodial as possible. So they're taking action in this direction to refine Bitcoin and create stuff that helps get towards this direction. So I like ARC. I like the idea that covenants can make it even better. I like drivechains because I think that, so people are critical and they say, yeah, you can do that on RGB, or you can do that on Taro, Taproot assets, or whatever you call it. But you have to consider that there are developers who invested and investors who put a lot of money into these Ethereum smart contracts, right? And they want something that's one-to-one compatible. So they want to port these contracts to a more resilient and secure network. And I think it's unfortunate that Rootstock, which was the sidechain that was supposed to do this, and not too many people know about it. Right now it's called RSK. That one was supposed to be the backup for Ethereum, but it was built as such. In case Ethereum fails for some reason, there's this Bitcoin sidechain that was created as a backup, and it was even funded by some of the Ethereum co-founders. But as a drive chain, to have Ethereum features without ETH, the token, and only have Bitcoin for these use cases, not only that it builds upon the Bitcoin economy, but it's also more secure because it's being secured by the Bitcoin miners, which is a lot more secure than proof of stake. At the same time, I understand the skepticism, and I'm aware that there's this idea that the miners can steal from the drive chain. You put your money there, it gets locked up for 6 months, and the miners are incentivized to collect transaction fees from that drive chain, right? But if you look at it, you're going to realize that there's more money being deposited in the drive chain than the money that gets collected through fees. And you can assume bad faith, and you can think that the miners are going to use their unfair advantage to steal that money. But then you also look at the Bitcoin blocks, and you see that the block reward is 6.25 Bitcoin right now. It's going to be 3.125 Bitcoin next year. And then you look into how much Bitcoin is being transacted in each block, and you realize, okay, they could 51% attack the network, and they could reorg blocks to steal some money to get it to their own address, That's possible. The reason why they don't do it is the same reason why the farmers are not burning their crops to get insurance money or something. They could do that, but at the same time, it destroys their business model. And I think that the game theory is pretty good in Bitcoin, and the incentives are pretty solid. But it's also nice to debate and have these conversations as long as they're in good faith. I think there's also a lot of concern trolling and a lot of conservatisms for the sake of it, but not because people are willing to understand how the proposals work and why they exist. But to summarize, I like the fact that there's initiative and new developers are stepping in to make proposals. This is part of decentralizing also the development of the protocol.
In regards to drive chains in particular, I've heard people compare the line merge mining and the miner risk of theft in a way that's similar to like Stacks, which is another kind of like Bitcoin smart contracting layer. They've compared, I guess, with Stacks, there's been a problem where the miners have been incentivized to manipulate the transactions with the Stacks protocol to where they get the rewards for mining the Stacks blocks. I don't know how directly that translates to drive chains, but I've heard it, the comparison has been made. And then also, do you believe the claim that altcoins will come into Bitcoin in a big way if drive chains are enabled? I kind of think that ship has sailed, and that, I mean, the time to do that was probably like in 2016 rather than now. I think that altcoins are kind of like their own ecosystem now, and no matter how much wishful thinking Bitcoiners have, I don't see them like abandoning their Web3 proof of stake chains to come into Bitcoin via drive chains. What are your opinions on those topics?
First of all, there's no way to know unless you try. You can point out to different experiments, but at the same time, someone in 2009 could look at Bitcoin and say, this is too much like BitGold. This is kind of like Hashcash. And it also reminds me of eCash. All of these have failed before, so therefore this is going to fail too. I mean, it's a possibility that this one can take off. At the same time, I think the right question is, how much do these Ethereum people care about the security of their contracts? Because you can have multi-sigs or whatever that were set up by DeFi degens, or you can have institutions that have tried to build something that they want to keep around for a longer time, for 10 years or something. And of course, they're going to migrate towards the network that provides better security primitives. So I don't think the entire ecosystem is going to instantly move into drivechains or sidechains or anything that enables one-to-one porting of contracts and scripting language. But certainly there's going to be an audience for this. Just like, I mean, it's not a good example, but Liquid provided a pretty good service. And I think that the exchanges that are part of the federation were able to transact and make settlements between each other with more confidentiality and without showing up in these Twitter bots, the ones that show whale alerts that this amount of money has moved from this exchange to that exchange. So I think they were able to move around some Bitcoin without ringing the alarm that they did that, which is pretty cool. But that was a very niche use case, and it's something that was made specifically for this type of businesses that need that type of confidentiality. In the case of drive chains or any other sort of side chains. So for the record, I think also Rootstock RSK is cool. Also Liquid is cool, but they kind of failed in some regards. And maybe that drive chains would be better. There's no way to know until you try. And if you don't try, I guess you can just accept that Ethereum exists and it's going to provide a service to people who want to access a certain subset of finance applications. I'm in favor of any Bitcoin sidechain because I think it's a conservative approach to scalability. You know that blockchains as layer ones don't scale, but there's no issue with layer twos if you have a merge mine sidechain and it has big blocks or whatever, and it's more centralized. It's not as big of an issue if you have proper incentives. But you want to keep that base layer as decentralized and lightweight as possible, and then have a more elegant solution on top. I understand also the argument for Lightning, and I very much like Lightning, but I think, especially during times of very high demand for block space, it proved some of its limitations, and some nodes have gone on offline during that time, and some channels were forced closed. And that's unfortunate because Lightning was created specifically to avoid this type of situation, but it seems like it functions best when the fees are low. And it needs some sort of companion, something that exists alongside and provides not just an alternative, but also some extra features that you don't find in Lightning.
Okay. And in your mind, is that something like ARC or more something like Fedi or Cashew, like some sort of Xiaomi and eCash implementation?
For the record, I think I like Cashew because it enables basically people who use custodial Lightning wallets to do some mixing and get some anonymity on their coins. I think that's pretty cool. But something like Fedi kind of defeats the purpose of using Bitcoin, if you ask me. Because, of course, I understand the argument that those who are unbanked and can't afford to pay for an on-chain transaction will most likely not join to have this sovereign experience. But why not look for ways in which you can onboard them in a non-custodial way that they can afford, as opposed to giving up on the idea of self-custody and saying, yeah, why don't we establish community banks and enable anyone to set up their own bank? And what can possibly go wrong, Because I see Bitcoin as trust minimizing technology, something that's supposed to give you as much sovereignty and freedom as you can. But I did interview the Fedi people. The technology looks promising. I have them on my podcast. I think I gave them the roughest interview that anyone ever gave them, because the other guys from Matt Odell to Stefan Rivera are kind of invested in the project. So I don't think they can be as harsh as I was, but I basically asked them, what happens if the government seizes physically the servers that run this community bank? What happens then? You know? And I think the answer was along the lines of doing time-locked contracts so people can withdraw after a certain amount of time. But how can you be sure that the government is not going to be the entity that withdraws for them? So there are still some issues to figure out, because banks create trust, and trust is kind of anti-Bitcoin. We're not here because we want to trust someone else with our money. We are here because we want to build a world that eliminates some of this trust and gives us as much individual freedom as we can get. So I get the use case, but I think that something like ARC makes much more sense to me, because it enables self-custody to a greater extent. Also drivechains, but I'm trying to not shill them too hard. I'm just saying that I find them technologically interesting and also conservative in what they do. They don't try to revolutionize necessarily. They just try to give, on one hand, the miners more fees that they can collect, the users more features that they can benefit while using Bitcoin, and possibly get some people from altcoins, who realize, okay, this makes no sense anymore. Why would I bother with this token when I can just transact where there's more liquidity and there's a larger market? In the end, it all converges towards the hardest form of money. But it seems like, I think, so I have been thinking about this a lot. Why did Ethereum succeed? Because it was not the first proposal of its kind. Initially, the proposal was to scale colored coins and counterparty that are Bitcoin experiments from back in 2013 and 2014. And you had these people who wanted to create what they called Bitcoin 2.0 protocols. And one of the first ones was Mastercoin, and that was also the first ICO. And Mastercoin was rebranded into Omni, and that one was used by Bitfinex, for whom we are recording this podcast right now, to issue the first form of Tether. Tether existed on Bitcoin until, I think, 2019 or something, and then it was moved to Ethereum, and then it was moved to Tron. Now it's all over the place. But in the beginning, it was settled on Bitcoin. And there were other Bitcoin 2.0 proposals. One of them was called NXT, and it was proof of stake from the get-go. It had no pre-mine, no dev allocation, no nothing. It was a fair launch. It was a nice project which had most of what Ethereum aspired to have later, but somehow it failed, and Ethereum became the one that became the standard implementation. Now, even when Bitcoin got tokens, kind of like Ethereum with ordinals, they call them BRC20, specifically because they copied that model. So in some regards, they set the standard for what these tokens should be like. But I think that the naming convention is dumb. It makes no sense. So for some reason, this project succeeded. I think why it succeeded is specifically because some of the early investors were smart with their money and were able to finance some of the operations, some of the development, and some of the speculation. They created hype around everything. They made it look in 2017, for example, that anyone could do an ICO. They just copy and paste some code. They build a website, and then they distribute the tokens. And then hopefully they're not going to be scammers, but 90-something% turned out to be scammers. And then I think they did something similar with NFTs when they created hype. They were able to use some of that pre-mined, 72 million ethers were pre-mined, and I think the supply is 120 million right now. So too much of it was pre-mined, and some of the early investors were able to profit from that number go up and create hype around the network to promote certain use cases. At one point during the 2021 bubble, we had Paris Hilton and Jimmy Fallon lecturing us about NFTs and why they're valuable. Of course, that turned out to be a bad situation, and a lot of people lost their money because of it. But it was because there's this money that goes into Ethereum, and it fuels the speculation. The foundation itself has its budget. They buy, they sell. It's kind of scary that they can get away with this, but the way in which they operate is different from Bitcoin and has been from the get-go. They play this political game where they pay for lobby groups, and they have people in Washington, I think it's Coin Center, that goes to inform people about why they should not over-regulate this type of technology. To some extent, it was experimentally beneficial in the sense that maybe for all of the shitcoinery, we had more advancements in cryptography, such as zero-knowledge proofs and stuff like DeFi. I mean, it started on Bitcoin, right? It was not called DeFi. It was just a decentralized exchange on counterparty. And the idea was from the get-go to be able to trade gold, to trade silver, maybe other commodities for Bitcoin without a trusted third party, and be able to issue your own shares as a company on the blockchain. Now, I know that blockchains don't scale and we have better solutions, but this is where it started. And all of this was designed for Bitcoin by Bitcoiners. It's kind of unfortunate that we have this network which is competing in some regards with Bitcoin, but also not competing because it's so different. And I think it would be cool to have some of that capital invested in Bitcoin, because on the long term, and not so long, maybe medium to long term, Bitcoin needs to collect more fees somehow. And I'm not sure how many users are willing to pay high fees constantly. Maybe it's a better idea to pay more fees that are small to compensate for the diminishing block reward. It's going to be interesting in the next 10, 15 years. And I hope I'll be around to see everything and participate in the debates, because we're just getting started, you know? I think all of this toxicity and all of these debates are only going to get more intense as we approach that moment, and we have to figure out the security budget. And the most drastic way, no, there are two drastic ways. One is to let the miners starve, and then we deal with an aftermath where we figure out if we're going to mine in our backyards, as in the entirety of users to mine without profit, just to secure the network. And the even worse scenario is the one where we break the 21 million coin limit. And I think Peter Todd is the main advocate for that scenario. He's like, yeah,
for a tail emission.
The survival of the network is more important than this 21 million meme. We can have tail emission, and we can assume that this amount of coins have been lost, and then we make sure that I guess a proportional amount gets issued as a mining reward, and it's perpetual so that miners are constantly getting paid. I'm not a fan of that, because I know that too many users are Austrian economists, and they got into this because they know there's a hard cap, there's a limit in the amount of coins that exist. And I think that's the looming threat, the one that we have to escape. We don't want to get there. But how do we not get there? Well, let's look at these proposals and fight with each other on Twitter.
Yeah. No, I think that's the best way to go about it for sure. Vlad, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure interviewing you. Besides the magazine and the podcast, is there anything else that you'd like to let our audience know about before you go?
Supra cycle. Get on board.
Supra cycle. Nice. Yeah. Hopefully, if this year's halving goes correct, we all get Supras, right?
And girlfriends. That's
and girlfriends.
Also the important part. Where nerds look at us like, do you think girlfriends would care about this stuff that we're talking about? They will be like, so what can you buy with that digital money? And then you're like, oh, I should probably buy gift cards or something, or use a third party to make a bank transfer on my behalf, and I send them the Bitcoin. I mean, we're not there yet, but we're getting there. And I guess we need Supra as a medium to find the middle ground between our nerdiness and their lack of care or what's going on. And then we have babies that hyper Bitcoinize the world.
I think so. That's the perfect way to end the show as well. So thanks again for coming on. How can people follow you? I know you're on Twitter, but what are your other social media links?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on NoStar. I don't know how to present my NoStar account because it's an NPub and lots of numbers.
Is your NPub link
On
to your
Twitter,
Twitter?
I'm Vlad Costea. It's THE because at Vlad Costea was taken when I set up my account, so I had to put something else. I didn't want to put a number, so I put THE, like the, before it. So THEVLADCOSTEA. I should post a lot. I post a lot of pictures of Toyota Supras and girlfriends because that's how I try to keep people motivated to be part of this movement. But beneath all of this superficial and very shallow approach to tweeting, I think there's a lot of substance. So you should check out the Bitcoin Takeover podcast if you're interested in what's happening with the Bitcoin project. It's like a middle ground between what you listen to on Robert Breedlove or whatever and what you hear on the Bitcoin Optech podcast, because I think that's where developers talk and it's the most advanced kind of conversation that you can listen to. But I think I provide a pretty nice middle ground. It's for intermediaries, it's for OGs. Check it out. And also the magazine. I think it's super nice. You can buy a hard copy from Shop and Bit or Bit store. And I think I'm in discussions with some store from the USA to have some distribution there. Fingers crossed, nothing is still set in stone, but I'm trying to get this everywhere so people can get their hands on it and be able to orange pill their friends, and maybe they get Supras and girlfriends afterwards.